So, we're talking about the voting history of some of the marginalized communities of color in the United States of America. Because I think the only group that didn't have to have an amendment or some legislative act to help them vote was white men. Yeah. And even they needed an amendment. Some of them did, but we'll talk about that later. Today, we are talking about Mexican Americans and some other Latinos. Yeah, let's start with Mexican Americans. This one took me some time, and I had to come back to it twice because I couldn't find where Mexican Americans got the right to vote. And that's because they've always had the right to vote, because they've always been considered citizens. Surprise? I know. I was surprised too. I found out from an Audible book. Yeah, let's talk about it. So, many Mexican Americans became citizens of the United States after the Mexican-American War ended in 1848 when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. The treaty gave the U.S. a large amount of land from Mexico, including California, Texas, and parts of Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. In exchange, the U.S. granted citizenship to nearly 80,000 Mexican citizens living in those states. The treaty also allowed Mexicans to choose to stay in the U.S. or move back to Mexico, essentially to choose to become Mexican citizens or become U.S. citizens. Now, we know that with citizenship comes the right to vote, but there was a problem. Do you know what that problem was? They weren't white. No. Now, granted, for the purposes of, census taking and population, amalgamation, whatever, I think I just made up words. Mexican people in the United States were considered white, but they weren't. Mexican people in the U.S. were reluctantly granted citizenship because of the treaty, but they were often forced into segregated communities, denied economic opportunities or voting rights, or deported for convenience, like with the Mexican repatriation during the Depression. But we'll talk about that later. Regardless, in the beginning, Mexican Americans voted in large numbers, and they were making changes that impacted their communities. And like blacks, they would soon experience problems. Whites would work to disenfranchise them through intimidation and dirty tactics, and they too would be impacted by things like the poll tax and literacy tests, in addition to English proficiency tests, because apparently the citizens were not aware of the Guadalupe Hidalgo Act. They probably just didn't care. And then, of course, we've got the language barrier. So, by this point, you know what I'm going to ask you, right? Right. When were Latinos able to vote without the poll tax, literacy tests, English proficiency tests, or intimidation? And this is going to be a two-part answer. You know the first answer, right? It's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yes, the act that was passed during the Civil Rights Movement to allow blacks in the South to register to vote and be able to vote without, being unalived. Yeah. The second answer is 1975, 3 years after I was born. On August 6, 1975, exactly 1 decade after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, following several court battles on behalf of Latino Americans, President Gerald Ford amended the act to end discrimination against language minorities, protecting the voting rights of Latinos as well as non-English speaking Asian Americans and Native Americans, making it possible to translate registration materials into other languages and strengthened the political power of communities of color. After the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the percentage of Latino voters has grown steadily from 44% in 1980 to 50% in 2020. Today, Latinos and Hispanics are the second largest voting bloc in the country. In 2020, Latinos cast 16.6 million votes, an increase of 30.9% from 2016. The 2020 election marked the first time in history when over 50% of eligible Latinos cast a vote. Well, that was a very special election, if we all recall, right? Right. Despite these gains, voter suppression laws aimed at depressing the Hispanic and Latino vote persist in states such as Arizona and Texas. I don't know why. 36% of Latinos voted for Trump in 2016. Before Kamala Harris entered the race for president, and it was Biden and Trump? It was running 50-50 as to who Latinos were going to vote for. And this is according to a July Pew Research survey. In that same survey, 49% say that Trump is mentally sharp and 52% think he'll make good economic decisions. Okay. See? Only in America can a marginalized community of color fight for the right to vote for the very same people who want to disenfranchise them in the first place. I mean, look at Texas SB 1. One of the components is that it will restrict access to language assistance at the polling place by making it a criminal offense to offer language assistance without proper documentation. And, their idea of proper identification is, unrealistic, given the sizable non-English speaking areas in Texas and the overall difficulty of acquiring proper documentation. This language element works to restrict access in a particularly insidious manner. But, keep voting for the people who aren't looking out for you. I mean, it's your prerogative after all. Not so fun fact. Did you know Puerto Rico's constitution, written in 1952 under the guidance of Luis Marin, designated the island as a commonwealth? Because Puerto Rico is not a state, its residents cannot vote in a federal election. Puerto Ricans who move to a state are eligible to vote, though. In 2020, Puerto Ricans were the second largest Latino eligible voting group at 13%.